Hello and welcome to the latest in a series of diversity webinars hosted by the Arts Council. I'm Anissa Moradadi, founder of Beat Freaks, a collective of people and companies unleashing creativity for good. And we're coming to you live from the iconic Midlands Arts Centre here in my home in Birmingham. Today I'm going to be joined by Abid Hussain, Director of Diversity at Arts Council, Deborah Commode, Chief Executive and Artistic Director at the Midlands Arts Centre, Joe Royce, Executive Director at Canduco, Dr. Kate Marsh, Artist and Researcher at Coventry University, and Rehan King, Chief Executive of York Museums Trust. We'll be discussing the Arts Council's annual diversity report, as well as hearing from our panel on their experiences in promoting inclusion and best practice. We've been collating questions in the run-up to today's broadcast, and if we don't manage to get to yours in today's session, we will come back to you directly, so keep on engaging, sending them in via Twitter. It's #CreativeCase, and make sure you tag the Arts Council. So grab your cuppa and let's get going. Abid, why this webinar and why now?
So Anissa, this is our third webinar looking at diversity and inclusion. We've really enjoyed having open, honest and sometimes challenging conversations which have really benefited from having a range of different viewpoints and perspectives that share best practice from both within the sector and outside of the sector. What's great about the webinar format is people can engage and watch at the time they want to. I think my kids are watching at home right now, they're on half-term leave. And it also allows conversations to carry on beyond the kind of original webinar. And today's webinar is very much focused on the launch of our latest Equality, Diversity and the Creative Case report, so we can go through some of the data trends that have emerged from the report this year.
Thanks, Abid. It's all very exciting. It feels like we're on the Ellen show. As Abid said, today we'll start by going through some of the trends from this year's diversity report. And we'll also be hearing from Deborah Commode from MAC on how they've approached the creative case and what it means for them. This will be in discussion with Rehan King, Chief Executive of York Museums Trust, who'll bring a museum's perspective to the conversation. Finally, we'll be joined by Joe Royce and Kate Marsh to discuss approaches to disability and dance, a great case study for those working in this part of the sector. But before all of that, we're going to focus on the Equality, Diversity and the Creative Case report, which, as we've heard, has been published today. So, Abid, you've introduced some changes to this year's report. Can you talk us through them?
Well, there's 4 key changes. So the first major one is we're allowing readers to interact with the report and the data. So you will be able to search and filter data based on geography, art form and the level of investment. That's something we've not done before. And I think it'll give us a more granular picture of where there's good practice and where there's more work to be done. Historically, we've published an aggregated picture of creative case for diversity ratings. This is the first time we're publishing ratings for individual organisations, so you can look up our national portfolio organisations and see how well they're contributing to the creative case for diversity. Historically, we've had very limited data on audience diversity. This year, we've got some good quality data in terms of race, disability and gender, and we can share that with the public. And we're also including some data on our Developing Your Creative Practice Fund in terms of the investment trends. I guess what's really interesting about the report, because you can interact with it, it will probably be a more useful resource for the sector, both to look at their own performance, but also benchmark against their peers. And what I hope it will do is be a resource that they can use as they begin to think about our new 10-year strategy and how they can become more inclusive and relevant.
So you've used the S word. You've just released your 10-year strategy. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I've been incredibly fortunate to have been involved in the development work for our strategy, and we've been having conversations with the wider sector and the general public for the best part of the last 2 years. And what we've heard through those conversations, the evidence base that we've built up and the research that we've gathered has really kind of had an impact in terms of shaping our 3 outcomes and our 4 investment principles. From my perspective, I'm very much focused on looking at what we can do around inclusion and relevance. And I guess the work that we're doing there is centered around 3 key pillars. We genuinely want to accelerate the pace of change in terms of diversifying the workforce, leadership and the governance of the sector. The current performance isn't good enough, and we're going to be talking about how we can change that. I think the Creative Case for Diversity has made a really significant impact since we launched it in 2011. So we're keeping that commitment to ensuring organisations continue to diversify their programs, and the more they diversify their programs, we hope the audiences and the visitors that come and see the work reflect the diversity of England. And the third part, which I'm quite excited about, is the community aspect. So we want our organisations to interact and engage with communities more. So how do you involve local stakeholders? It's easy for me to sit here and say these are the things that the arts and creative sector need to do. Everything about the inclusion and relevance framework also applies to the Arts Council. So we have a number of challenges internally that we also need to address moving forward.
That's really good to hear, and I'm sure we'll all keep you accountable to that. So shall we get into the detail of this year's report a little bit more? Have any of the stats surprised you?
Well, one thing that I've really liked is the data that's come out of the investment trends for developing your creative practice. So they've exceeded my expectations in terms of the success rate for Black and minority ethnic applicants and disabled applicants. And I think it kind of shows what you can do when you develop new programs and develop and design them from the ground up. 51% of the investment has gone to female applicants as well. What's really been positive about developing your creative practice is the number of first-time applicants that were gained to the Arts Council. So it's a signal to us that actually, if you develop the right programs, you can become more relevant to people who've previously not come into the Arts Council for funding. That's not the whole picture. Looking at the broader data around workforce leadership and governance, the pace of change is too slow. We've introduced a number of diverse-led organisations into our portfolio, but I think the change in our larger organisations has been slow, and there has to be a higher level of expectation in terms of the change that we need to see in those organisations that receive larger amounts of funding to diversify their workforce leadership and governance.
And what are you going to do to kind of speed up that change?
Well, what I'm working on at the moment with colleagues at the Arts Council is developing our inclusion and relevance framework. So we've introduced the concept in the 10-year strategy, but there'll be more details on that in the delivery plan that we'll publish later this year. What I can say is we're absolutely committed to asking organisations to set challenging targets to diversify their workforce leadership and governance. And if they're not meeting those targets, they absolutely risk losing their funding. And we'll also be setting targets for our own workforce leadership and governance, because again, if we're asking the sector to do it, we need to model that best practice at the Arts Council.
And there's some really interesting trends in the data. What can you tell us about art forms, for example?
Well, hopefully later on when people go through the report, they'll be able to interact with all the data and filter to the criteria that they're interested in. But some key headlines, if we look at dance as an art form, it's the art form where we have the highest percentage of the workforce, which is from a Black and minority ethnic background, so that's about 18%. But equally with dance, it's got the lowest number of disabled people working in the sector from a percentage perspective, and Kate and Joe can talk about that a bit more later. I think there's a long way to go with our museums, so 6% of the museum's workforce is from a Black and minority ethnic background, and that's significantly behind the curve, even if you look at the overall averages. At a kind of leadership level, 52% of chief executives are female. The number decreases for chairs and artistic directors. So there's more work to be done there. And certainly from looking at some of the data for music, again, I think we need to look at how we can get more female representation within the workforce for music. And from an area perspective, London is the area where we have the highest percentage of BME workforce, which is around 15%, but that's still significantly lower than the working age population in London from a diverse background, which is around 40%.
Loads of rich insight there.
Yeah.
But what about audiences? Are there any trends there?
Well, this is the first time we've captured data on audiences. The good news is 2/3 of our audiences are female, so I think we need to do a lot more to kind of encourage more men to engage as audience members. 16% of our audiences would define as being from a Black or minority ethnic background, which is consistent with national averages, and actually the number of disabled people who engage as audiences is higher at 12% than the number we have in the arts and cultural workforce.
And so you mentioned workforce. What about your own workforce? What's the picture there?
We're seeing slow progress. So we've seen a 2% increase in the number of staff at the Arts Council from a black and minority ethnic background. So that's gone up from 9% to 11%. It's more promising at the director level, where it's 14%. The rate of change for disability is slower, so it's gone up a percentage point from 6% to 7%. Approximately 2/3 of our workforce are female, and more encouragingly, 55% of our directors now at the Arts Council are female too.
Thanks, Abid. You're like a data machine. Following on from that snapshot of the big headlines, I'm going to ask Deborah and Rehan to join me to discuss their perspectives on both audiences and workforce diversity. But before I do that, we have this short film that gives you a bit of a flavour of the work done here at MAC. So it looks like MAC had a great summer last year, and I'm actually joined here by the Chief Executive, Deborah Commode, and Rehan King, who's the CEO of York Museums Trust. First of all, hello, welcome. Deborah, can I start by asking you about your approach to audiences? What's that journey been?
Our approach is to understand who we serve. Last year we welcomed over 1 million footfall, and that's really important for us in the sense that we are a data-rich organisation. So we use that information to help us best serve our communities. We also realise that we are a hyper-local venue for our audiences, so 82% of those that visit us are Birmingham residents, and so they want to come and see a very vibrant, fresh approach to the work that we do because they use us all the time, which is excellent. We also know, of course, Birmingham is a culturally rich, diverse city, but it's really important because it has that international flavour that we reflect the real life experiences of those of our residents, both on the stage and on the gallery walls, and also very much throughout the workforce. So it's incredibly important for us that, that their opinions and their ideas matter to us, that real life experience that they're having. And that we can therefore share in those common stories of everyday life, whether that's stories of migration or mental health or people's family lives. Those are the kind of storytelling that people want to see at MAC.
So you've touched on this, but kind of that data and that audience insight, how has it impacted your programming and how will it moving forward?
Well, we have to be very strategic, don't we? So we don't just look at commissioning and programming. It also informs us in terms of operations, catering, what we serve in the restaurant, in the cafe is really important. It's also important to say that access and inclusion is not just an ethical consideration, but it's business critical. Because at MAC, we make 85% of our own earned income. And we have to make sure that not just creatively, but financially, that we offer relevance to people's lives, and because we need to, continue to be resilient financially. So that's really important for us, that we see it as a business case as much as it is an ethical consideration.
I love that, I completely agree. And obviously people are really also business critical, so tell us a little bit about the workforce here. What's the story on that?
Yeah, I mean, the diversity of our workforce is improving. I'm particularly keen to, as with the board, to work to having a much more a push to include people with more disabilities, particularly hidden disabilities as well. We're finding a lot when we're recruiting, there's a number of people that aren't accessing or feel that they can be part of our team because they perhaps don't necessarily feel that they can be part of our team because of other considerations in their lives. So we have to think about that as a much more nuanced approach to our workforce. Workforce for us, as it would be for many others, is also about volunteers, and that's really important. We recently created a new initiative called the A Team, which A stands for access, and it was very much about having a really strong recruitment program and development program for volunteers with disabilities who then work with other visitors with disabilities. So if you're so you recognise yourself in a sense coming in with somebody who may be able to lead you round and be part of that experience of MAC is incredibly important. We want to get that kind of authentic feeling. The other thing to say is it's not just about what we do here in Birmingham, but it's also part of being part of a national programme. And so alongside DASH, we are part of a deaf and disabled curatorial network. And that's really important, that peer-to-peer across the country, from Wising Arts all the way up to Middlesbrough, we ensure that we are having that critical conversation with each other, really, and that we are offering opportunities not just to mentor young disabled curators, but have them challenge us back and be a critical friend to us, and that's really important as well. So it's threaded through all of our programming, but also in the way that we approach our strategic planning. So that's, yeah.
Great, thank you. And Rhiannon, does any of that chime with your experience at York Museums Trust?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think the thing that chimes most is Deborah's attention on making sure that diversity is integrated across all the things that you do, and also on strategic planning and that sense of long-term commitment. So for us, our audiences are really different to the audiences here in MAC. A lot of our audience are tourists, so it's quite a different market, if you like. But that doesn't mean that we don't want to have that long-term commitment. So we're making a long-term commitment to our local Gypsy, Roma and traveller community, and also to refugees across Yorkshire. And that long-term commitment is really so important in terms of being real, in terms of that engagement being long-lasting. But also the other thing is around planning. So we have 3 criteria for our public programme, and one of those criteria is around diversity and reaching new audiences, and that ensures that when we make those key decisions, the diversity agenda is right there as we're making those key decisions and as we're forward planning in time. I think the other thing I'd say is that for us, being able to think about creative case for diversity ensures that we bring a full reflection of the diversity of society as it's reflected in artists and artwork. And often that's something that actually people in York have not encountered. So it gives us a way to bring a much richer programme to the city. And I think also with our applying creative case to our collections, we can show displays that are much more relevant and thought-provoking as a result of using that lens.
And what do you think is different about approaching diversity as a museum?
It's the collections. So having collections is what makes our museums different to the other art forms. But collections are such a rich resource, and collections are often a bit of a burden for museums. There's so many of them, but that's also a hugely rich and varied resource, and that means that we can go through those collections and find new things and constantly be doing new research. And so what that means is we can then raise questions and challenge assumptions that perhaps in the past have not taken into account diversity. So a really good example would be we've got a Roman skeleton, and she's a high status Roman lady. We know that because of her tomb. She's buried with her jewellery. We've done research on her, and we know that she's also of North African origin. So there we have evidence of a North African high status person living in York in the 4th century, and so evidence of that long and complex black presence in England.
So interesting. What lessons do you think that other museums might take from your experience?
There's 2 things I think I'd highlight. One is there can be, I've observed in museums a fear of getting it wrong, and that then stops people actually taking risks. So the example I'd give is when in our own organisation we wanted to start engaging with the Gypsy Roma traveller community, we knew that as an institution we had to build bridges, because as an institution in the past we had taken off display a really key object for that community and not given access to that community to that object. So starting from there, we've been working really respectfully with that community, and we're now co-producing a display for Gypsy, Roma and Traveller History Month in June. The other thing I think I'd say is, sometimes museums are not the best people to actually do the engagement work, and there are often people who are much better placed already in communities. So working with partners is a really important part of what we do at York Museums Trust, and the City of Sanctuary partnership that we have has absolutely helped us to reach refugee groups who just wouldn't have reached otherwise.
Thanks both, that's really useful, loads of food for thought, fascinating insight into how art galleries and art centres and museums can really build links with local communities, so thank you. I'm now going to ask Jo Royce and Kate Marsh to join me to discuss dance and diversity, but first this short film from Canduco. Okay, and now I'd like to welcome Jo Royce, Executive Director of Canduco, and Dr. Kate Marsh, artist and researcher from Coventry University. Hey both, welcome. So we heard earlier from Abid that there's a bit of a mixed picture when it comes to diversity in dance. There's been some progress in the inclusivity of those marginalised by their ethnicity, but it's not necessarily the same story when it comes to disability. Do any of you have a take on why that might be?
Yes, I think there are continued barriers to access. We're working within disabling environments, systems and structures that are restricting opportunities for disabled people. I will say that Canduco has led the way on inclusive practice for the last 30 years. We were founded on the basis that diversity is exciting and that dance is richer when different bodies and approaches are part of its creation. From the very beginning, our performance programmes and our learning activity has centred on creating opportunities for and representation of disabled dancers. And within our workforce statistics, which for us will cover our dancers, the artists and teachers that we work with, and our staff, in 1819, 23% identified as disabled. The distinction, I think, is therefore when we look at our artists and our dancers and our teachers, that is 50-50 in terms of disabled and non-disabled artists and makers. And when we drill down into looking at our staff team and our board, we still aren't quite there when it comes to representation. It's not quite reflected in the same way. And that's where we've then got to focus within Canduco and within dance as a sector, I think. Charlotte Derbyshire, who's the artistic director of Canduco, and myself are non-disabled leaders. And that doesn't sit comfortably with us. It is reflective of the sector, and looking at that lack of disability from entry level through to leadership is something that we talk about all the time. We want the decisions that we're making within Canduco, about Canduco, its artistic plans, its organisational future, to be made in conversation with our disabled peers. I don't want to be sitting on a panel talking about disability, not sitting next to a disabled leader, which is why it's so vital that Kate's part of this conversation today, because that's how we'll start to see that sector change.
Absolutely. And Kate, what do you want to add here?
I think I just would pick up on Joe's point about the conversation. And for me, there's something really important about visibility. And I think I've become increasingly aware of making myself visible in these kind of contexts and understanding the implications of an absence of disabled artists or disabled voices in these kinds of conversations, and the impact of that on moving forward and having progressive debate, because if those voices are absent, we're always going to be maintaining the discourse in a relatively normative framework. So it's essential that these conversations bring in lived experience and an authentic perspective on what it is to be a disabled artist in the dance sector. And I think that's why, for me, I suppose it's going back to Abid's earlier point when Abid was discussing pace of change. And I think from my individual perspective, I've had an increasing dissatisfaction, for want of a better word, around the pace of change, particularly around dance and disability, that disabled artists are still restricted to performance contexts. So there's not enough exposure or highlight on disabled makers, disabled academics, disabled power holders, whatever that means. And I think that's really important, that we start to rethink and bring in those voices and make the experiences of disabled artists more visible. And in doing that, we can extend our discussion beyond access and participation into asking the more difficult questions, I think, around how we can shift the environment that we're working in to make it much more, to give it more equity.
And how does Canduco kind of interact with those challenges? So, you know, what is the company doing to create change?
Absolutely. I think recognising Kate's points about lived experience and the fact that Charlotte and I in our leadership position don't have a lived experience of disability, one of the first things that we did when we took up post was to create a disability advisory group of disabled artists, makers and leaders in their own right, of which Kate, I'm pleased to say, is one of them. And recognising the necessity of that voice authentically being part of the conversation within Canduco, both about what we're doing artistically, but how we are going to be part of that change. More broadly, we have a plan to increase the diversity on our board. We have a third of our trustees are disabled at the moment, and we want that to be 50-50 representative split by the end of this year. We are reviewing our recruitment practices, and that has improved. We've recently made a couple of appointments of disabled employees, one of whom I'm really pleased to say is an artist called Kimberly Harvey, who we've worked with across a number of years. She will be joining us as Canduco's Director of Youth Dance, which will be a really vocal, embedded part of the company, talking about how we're developing opportunities for young people. And we've worked with Kimberly for a long time. Kimberly was a member of that youth company. She's been part of our training programs and has been an artist and maker with us for a long time, and is an artist and maker in her own right. And I think for us, we're as equally excited about the learning and conversation that we'll be in with Kimberly as part of that ongoing relationship with this new role that she'll be in. So, and Kate, I know that's something we've talked about a lot as well.
Yes, I think that, I wouldn't want to paint a picture where I think that in order to achieve, to improve the data on the number of disabled people in workforces in the arts takes years and years and years. However, I think there's something very interesting in Kimberly's appointment, that it has arisen through conversation and through time and through really addressing what what Kimberley needs to be in post, and how Canduco and Kimberley can work with each other and benefit from each other. And I think for me that speaks really clearly to an environment that I see all too often, where there's a resistance to change in the normative frameworks. So actually what tends to happen is that people with a diverse need, for example, a disabled artist is being asked to conform and fit into a structure that doesn't meet their needs. And so many times I've seen that not work. And I think that's really that's a really detrimental situation. So through authentic and genuine conversation, I think we can begin to really shift and bring people into those positions, but it has to be on the terms of what the actual needs of that disabled artist are, rather than fitting them into a structure that doesn't work for them.
Absolutely. I feel like I can't go on without saying congratulations to Kimberley. So let's just get that in there. So it sounds like in so many ways you're, leading the way in this space. What are the challenges and realities that come with being in that position?
I think it's absolutely the reality of it, and to be open about it. It's what Kate has said, is that takes to work inclusively and to do that authentically takes time, takes capacity, resource and support. It's absolutely about learning and listening and responding to the needs of an individual, and doing and creating the environment in conversation with them. And that is woven into the fabric of what Canduco does. And we do have that continued commitment to supporting disabled artists and teachers, and then to see that work and that growth continue within our staff team and board as well. And I think there is still fear around getting it wrong. We are working in an environment of austerity. Access to work is being capped. Arts funding, there are restricted pots. People are putting access lines into their budgets, which is fantastic, but actually that need and that line might need to be shifted and increase or move in response to an individual. And I think that there is perhaps a fear and apprehension about that if you're, as I said earlier, not working within a system and structure that is responsive and able to flex in the way that's needed. And Kate, again.
Well, I think we were talking earlier about access as a fluid thing, so that it changes from person to person, and within an individual person it changes from day to day or project to project. And I think that it is important to acknowledge that because of austerity, because of the political and economic landscape that we're all existing in, I have a very real concern that the cost of access makes the position of the disabled dance artist really precarious, and they're made fragile by becoming a risk, or becoming more expensive than a non-disabled peer, or even a less disabled peer. And I think we need to really radically rethink how access is included in our budgets, how access needs are funded, and also that they, as Jo has quite rightly said, how they shift and change. And I think we need to adapt to that with each individual, absolutely. And in doing that, we can create a situation where artists and organisations and funding bodies can then focus on the art and the practice, which I think is what we all want.
Yeah.
Such rich insight. Thank you so much for that. Really interesting to unpick the challenges as well in such a refreshing and open and honest way. So thank you so much. Now I'd like to ask all of our guests to rejoin me so that we can take some of the questions that we've been getting from you via Twitter and email. Are you ready, guys?
Yeah.
Okay, so firstly, a question around children and young people and creativity in education. You all look terrified. People are lovely, just trust them. So firstly, Professor Deborah Sugg-Ryan wants to know, how do we ensure that state school educated students whose schools have cut arts subjects have access to careers in the arts? Deborah, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we continue to lobby schools. Let's not let them off the hook here. It's really important that they understand the benefits and the value of a culturally rich, diverse programme. However, let's be realistic, across the country, school leadership is very patchy when it comes to this. And so we need to ensure that talent pipeline continues to be fed. That's really, really important. And so it's it's our responsibility as arts organisations and as artists to ensure that the programmes of work out of school are as important as the actual examinations, GCSEs or whatever. And so here at Mac, for instance, what we refer to as learning participation is a huge programme of work. We're in half term at the moment, but it happens in the evenings and at weekends, so that there's this really rich practical programme of work where young people can have access to professional artists, and that's the most important thing, sometimes which you don't actually get in at school, but you have access to a whole range of different art forms, and so that people feel that they can be inspired even if they don't choose to have a career in the arts, so they recognise the benefit that the arts environment will have for their entire life, and that's really important. So I would say that we have to just ensure that we're creative with our programmes and that we access, whether that's through the bridge organisations or whatever, but we access children and young people for whom arts doesn't happen with mum and dad at home or in the home environment, and it certainly doesn't happen at school. So I would say it's sort of a rally call to all of us really to ensure that we are helping young ones, you know, enjoy being artists, but being around artists as well.
Thank you. And a question around diversity and leadership has come in. So Ruth Hecht wants to know why, despite all the reports and training and initiatives, and are there still so few diverse people in key leadership positions in MPOs? How and when will it ever change? Abid, I'm coming to you.
From my perspective, I think there's a couple of things that we could look at, and just reflecting on the data that was published, I think there's less of an issue in terms of diversity in leadership in some of those smaller diverse-led organisations, but we have to be quite honest about why some of those smaller diverse-led organisations exist, because so many diverse leaders have felt excluded from the larger, bigger institutions, and that's where we need to see change. I think we've seen with the creative case for diversity what impact policy can make on programming, and I think what you're seeing today and in the 10-year strategy is a real focus on diversifying the leadership, workforce and governance moving forward. And for the first time, we're now beginning to talk about targets and what happens if those targets are not met. And I think this is a kind of moment for us as a sector to really step up to the plate and have those uncomfortable conversations about which voices are missing from the table, who's not involved in our decision making, and who needs to start thinking about giving up power or sharing power to make sure we see different voices, different perspectives across the boardroom and at that kind of leadership level.
Absolutely. And Kate, you were a change maker, right? You were on the change maker programme. What's your take on kind of how we look at leadership then?
I mean, the first thing I would say is that, just to go back to the question, around leadership initiatives, in my experience, those formal leadership initiatives or training courses are deeply informed by a normative understanding. There's a significant lack of representation in those initiatives from people who would identify as being other, and I think that is problematic in the first instance. So they may be less attractive to disabled artists, or they're not seeing themselves represented. Therefore, it kind of perpetuates a cycle of resisting those models. The other thing that I think, just to respond to how we think about leadership, is I actually think we're at a point in the arts or in society generally where we need to. It's really important that we rethink what leadership might be, because I think all too often we're understanding leadership as a set thing, and we're trying to so we don't recognise it when it happens in diverse ways. And I think that's something I'm really interested in interrogating more, that actually what does leadership through artistic practice look like, which was certainly my experience in Changemakers, that I knew at the beginning of that 18-month development programme, I didn't want to be a leader in the way that the arts sector may understand leadership to be. I didn't want to be a director. I didn't want to wear a suit or have a real job. I really I wanted to be leaderful with my peers and through my artistic practice. And I think that's what we need to rethink, that what leadership actually looks like and can be.
that's so important to just blow open the frame and stop getting, particularly I think a lot of people put the emphasis on the person to assimilate and to be prepared to be in the system, which we know is no longer working. I'm with you. So Daniel Dorr wants to know, how do we create space for the underrepresented without being tokenistic or ticking boxes? Rayhan, what do you think about that?
Well, I think the first thing is about how you engage with the people that you engage with. And that to me is what makes the difference between being tokenistic or not. So if you empower people properly to work with you and you're working respectfully, you're giving them credit, you're allowing them to actually lead the process in partnership with you, that's a completely different thing to a kind of tick box engagement exercise. And I think certainly my organisation and I think museums and probably other parts of the art form all need to kind of work harder at actually redefining what we mean by engagement. So engagement isn't just doing an activity, engagement is about handing over some power. And I think we're all a bit challenged by that. But I think that's the direction that we need to go in. And then the other thing I think is about being strategic. So whilst I've said at York Museums Trust we're focusing on a couple of communities, it's really important that while we retain those links and we keep that relationship going, that doesn't become too comfortable and we don't find that in 10 years' time we're still only working with those communities, and because that's easy and it ticks a box. It's really important to be strategic. So when you're thinking about working, most museums, for example, do work with communities already, but I think they sometimes need to take a sort of stop and check and just think, right, are we being strategic about this? Are we actually reaching new people? Are we actually thinking strategically about who's got protected characteristics in our communities that we might not be engaging with? So I think that's what stops it being tokenistic, is if you're constantly making that check, being strategic, thinking about how you reach out.
And Jo, what do you think the balance is between kind of tokenism and representation?
I think it goes back to a question of authenticity and who you're talking to, and developing conversations, which for us is with our audiences, our participants, our artists, to listen and reflect and think about how we are creating space, how are we representing, and for us, as I've mentioned before, the phase for us now is about taking that representation from the work that we make and making that part of the organisation that we are and thinking about that really holistically. But that has to be done and in conversation with, and that conversation has to be authentic. And to Abid's earlier point, some of those conversations might be challenging, but unless we step up to the plate to have them and to be having them with the people who we are making work with and for, it will be tokenistic. It's that place of representation, that place that has to come from conversation, it has to be direct, it has to be open.
I think we could kind of have a whole other webinar just on that, so we'll kind of pause that one there. But so Alok wants to know, this one's to everybody now, okay. They want to know, do you think we are honest and daring enough in how we question and challenge diversity in the arts and cultural sector? Anyone? Anyone brave enough to answer that?
No. We need to be bold, we need to be brave. And I think today's report on diversity is possibly more granular than it's ever been before. And I think that's really welcome for all of us, because I think we have to act collectively as a sector. We've got to learn from each other. I know that's a very simple thing to say, but we've got to use that information, because our purpose is to serve others and to ensure that we get this right. So I think we have to use today's report as a resource. We've got to read it and we've got to share it as well with our trustees and all of our staff, actually, so they feel part of that, so that we can listen and learn from it. It's the first step forward. So I would say that it's a really good resource for peer-to-peer discussion, and the worst thing we can do is just sort of, download it, leave it in a folder on our computer and not use it as an active document. So it's really important.
Absolutely, keeping that data alive and using it as a stimulus for the conversation. I think that's really useful kind of from an organisational perspective, but what about from an artist perspective?
Well, I think it's really important to acknowledge that certainly what I'm seeing, both organisationally with my work at Metal and as an artist myself, is that I think that practitioners are being honest and daring. I actually think that we're we're living in a time where almost through necessity, people are using their practice to ask difficult questions or to present their lived experience or to use their artistic practice to be daring and to be honest. So I think actually there's something about bridging that gap between the work that's happening that artists are making and how that's being responded to by organisations and funding bodies. And I think there's something, you know, maybe it's about shifting the table. So actually it's not the artist looking up to the funding bodies and the gatekeepers, and maybe it's switching that the gatekeepers and the funders and the organisations need to look at what the artists are saying and doing, and that's where some of the answers might be.
It's a super powerful imagery to just kind of end on, and I'm sure you're all devastated to hear that we've now come to the end of our live stream, but just before we go, I'd like to say thank you to everybody on the panel and thank you to everybody that's tweeted in as well. Remember, you can keep the conversation going. This has actually only just been the start of that, so get using the hashtag Creative Case, tag Arts Council England, and we'll get back to everyone. From all of us here at Arts Council, at Midlands Arts Centre, and on behalf of Arts Council, goodbye.